Carter came to power in hopes of re-injecting moralism into the conduct of U.S. foreign affairs. And for this reason, his foreign policy had perhaps three main pillars. The first was the continuation of détente, improved relations with the Soviet Union, but also China. The second was non-proliferation, the attempt to uphold the non-proliferation treaty and keep the number of nuclear powers as low as possible. And finally, to reassert the importance of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. There were triumphs, most notably the Camp David Accords, which Carter orchestrated between the Egyptian and Israeli leaders, which formally ended the state of war between Egypt and Israel that had existed since 1967. But there were also setbacks. And in fact, in retrospect, the Carter foreign policy would be seen through the prism of its failure to deal with the situation in Iran. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 brought to power a fundamentalist Islamic regime, which saw the United States as the primary villain in a story of Western oppression. In reaction, crowds in Iran seized 52 American diplomats and citizens, holding them for 444 days. And this truly proved the event that destroyed Carter's presidency. Simultaneously, an oil crisis touched off by the Iranian Revolution caused oil prices and gas at the pump to rise 250% in price, leading to stagflation and a major recession in the U.S. economy. That same year in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, bringing an end to the détente experiment and starting a new proxy war for the Soviet Union that would eventually prove its own Vietnam. So by the time of the 1980 presidential elections, Ronald Reagan was running on a platform that presented the Cold War as something worth fighting and something that was in fact a morality tale, a tale of good and evil between an American system that could promote liberty and economic opportunity versus a Soviet system that, as he characterized it, would end up on the, quote, ash heap of history. His election also brought to power more hardliners in his administration. He was affiliated with the Committee on Present Danger, which had a more alarmist assessment of Soviet military capabilities and intentions, and thought that the Soviet Union would actually contemplate a first strike on the United States. He was more willing to characterize the Soviet Union in black and white terms, calling it, quote, an evil empire. And this heated up rhetoric led Moscow to worry that the United States actually meant what Reagan was saying. In 1983, a NATO nuclear exercise, codenamed Able Archer, was perceived by Moscow as a possible prelude to a nuclear first strike. But from this crisis actually came a moment of opportunity. Reagan and his foreign policy were, in retrospect, quite paradoxical. He was much more convinced that Soviet communism contained the seeds of its own destruction, but he was also much more willing to work with individuals on the other side that he felt he could trust. As he said, he always wanted to negotiate with Soviet leaders, but they, quote, kept dying on me. And this was true. Between 1983 and 1985, 3 Soviet general secretaries would fall ill and perish, beginning with Brezhnev and then Andropov and Chernenko. But this brought to office a reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was willing to try out new strategies, not only for the Cold War, but also for Soviet society. He described his reforms as twofold. First, a desire to restructure the Soviet economy, known as perestroika, and secondly, to encourage transparency, openness about how the government did its business, which he called glasnost. In time, at the urging of a number of people within his administration, but also abroad, in particular the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Reagan began to see Gorbachev as someone he could work with. At a summit in 1985 in Geneva, the two declared together that nuclear war must never be fought and could never be won. In 1986, and perhaps one of the most surprising chapters of the Cold War, Reagan and Gorbachev sat down in sat down in Iceland at Reykjavik and came within a hair's breadth of negotiating nuclear disarmament between the Soviet Union and the United States. The only sticking point being whether or not Reagan's dream of an anti-ballistic missile defense would have to remain in the laboratory for its testing, or if it in fact could be tested outside of the laboratory. Now, as the United States and the Soviet Union were beginning to pursue more cooperative relationships despite Afghanistan, Eastern Europeans were beginning to take matters into their own hands. In particular, the Solidarity movement in Poland was beginning to push the Soviet-backed regime to extend more economic and political freedoms. And while in 1981, Brezhnev had been willing to crack down on the Solidarity movement, Gorbachev instead was more permissive. Other Eastern Europeans took this as a signal that the Soviet Union would not repeat the mistakes of the past, in particular the crackdown in Hungary in 1956, as well as in Czechoslovakia in 1968. In 1989, therefore, when a low-level minister in the East German government mistakenly noted that the borders with Western Europe and West Berlin were now open, average Germans on both sides of the wall took to the streets and brought down the Berlin Wall, ending really in their own hands, in the hands of the population rather than its leaders, really the central point of controversy in the Cold War. 2 years later, facing his own nationalities question in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev presided over the collapse of the Soviet Union itself as politicians and publics in Estonia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia itself demanded more autonomy from Moscow. And on Christmas Day 1991, that's what they received, as the Soviet Union officially was dissolved. The Soviet flag, the hammer and sickle, was lowered from the Kremlin, and in its place, the tricolor red, white, and blue flag of the Russian Federation went up.